this culture, you are not really allowed to say no to who shows up and says they want you. If a man says he wants you, then he's God's man for you, and you have to learn how to adjust your feelings and thoughts around that.
That was Tia Levings from the Shiny Happy People documentary, that Amazon documentary that looked into the Duggars and the Gothard movement that founded, or that the Duggars subscribed to. Tia is joining us today on the Bare Marriage Podcast, and I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from baremarriage.com, where we like to talk about healthy, evidence-based biblical advice for your sex life and your marriage. And when Tia was looking for advice, she did not get healthy, evidence-based, and biblical. She got fundamentalism, and she ended up in a really abusive situation that she had to find the courage to escape. So I am so looking forward to sharing my interview with her with you. Before we do that, though, I want to say a big thank you to our sponsor for this podcast, the Kingdom Girls Bible. If you want your girls to feel part of the story, to make sure the women in Scripture aren't left out, do check out the Kingdom Girls Bible. It's just wonderful. And if you want to support our podcast, you could do that by joining our Patreon. You can give as little as $5 a month and be part of our amazing Facebook community, or at a little bit higher tiers, you get access to unfiltered podcasts and more. And if you like what we do with our research and getting it out there, we've got some pastor training coming up. We've got all kinds of neat things where we're trying to get our information out there wider and wider to more people. You can get tax deductible receipts for that within the United States through the Good Fruit Faith Initiative. And I'll put the links to those things in the podcast notes. And now, without further ado, I am so happy to bring Tia onto the podcast.
So I am so thrilled to have my friend Tia Levings on the podcast. I feel like we're friends, Tia.
I know we are, and we've been Instagram buddies forever, and it's like such an honor to finally get to put like a conversation together.
Yeah, I know when I was watching Shiny Happy People, I was like, I know her, you know.
Yes.
That was great. So I got an early copy of The Well-Trained Wife, and it is amazing. And just really, you're very insightful about yourself. You know, a lot of people write memoirs and they don't, they make themselves out to be the good guy. And while you obviously are, you don't shy away from saying, like, this is where I was going off track. This is where I was thinking wrong things. This is where I was, you know, and
that was intentional and the result of a lot of hard work. And I think it matters that my memoir began as a therapeutic exercise. I sold it on the 13th draft. So it began like 9 years earlier as therapy journals. And so I think that self-reflection and timeliness of each scene, like one of the feedbacks I get a lot is that it feels like you're in the scene with me, I think is a reflection of that, because I was very intentional about making sure, what was I like at that point? Like if we put too much of our former self into the scene, then it sounds kind of lofty. But if we're just who we are at that moment, it's a more relatable growth journey, I think.
Yeah, it was really well written. It was tragic, but I think it's so relatable, and a lot of people are going to see themselves in it, even if their cases are not as extreme as yours. And I think that's why I'm so excited about this book, because it shows how it's not just abuse. It's the fact that the teachings that are so prevalent in evangelicalism actually enabled this and made it worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it really matters that my story begins at a Southern Baptist megachurch with 20,000 on the roll. You know, like I was not in a fringe group. This is in normal, ordinary, mainstream America, and my story is an example of how it can go. Doesn't go that way for everyone, but the path that I was on is the same path that many people are on, and this is one of the outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so your book opens with this scene, which is like later on, right before you leave your husband. So it doesn't open as a kid. It opens and sets the stage of the abuse that happened. And I just want to read something that you said there, because I think it'll set the stage for our listeners now too. All along, I thought I was protecting the kids, shielding them from realities behind closed doors, sacrificing to maintain a two-parent Christian home. making hard, better choices for their faith, family, and education than I made for myself, trying to safeguard them from pain. But they saw. That was obvious now. And staying meant raising sons who hit women. Staying meant raising a daughter who stayed with a man who hit her. And that would be my fault. I'd be the one who taught them life like this was okay. And so you left at 33 with 4 kids in tow and no education.
I did. And all of my belongings left behind. I mean, we really did make a visceral escape that night. Um, and that was my decision point. That was I opened the book there because that was the breaking point of um, culpability, complicity, realization. You know, I say often, like when I'm talking about my life now, that one of my growth edges in life has been that I stay in situations too long. I let them get too out of hand because a believer in we can make it better. With God, all things are possible. Little is much if God is in it. I'm a really capable person. I can fix this. I can make it better, and fiercely loyal. All of that, the flip side of all of that is that I stay in situations that are not
Mhm.
sustainable for too long. And so my growth edge has been pulling that back each time, doing a little better each time. But that scene was the big scene where I realized we're going to die if I stay here. And if
Yeah.
we don't die, that I'm raising the next generation of abusers and people who think it's okay to stay in abuse and that this whole dynamic is healthy and normal and okay. And it just wasn't.
Yeah, it just wasn't. And then you go backwards in your memoir,
Mhm.
um, to how it all started. And so let's go back to the beginning. So you're 10 years old. You're ready
Yeah.
to get into it?
Okay.
Okay.
I am.
Um, so here you are, you're a little girl in you're 10 years old and you end up in Jacksonville, Florida,
Yes. So I
right?
had to really like when you're writing a memoir, you have to decide where you're going to start. And so this where I start is because when I get through my life that gets me to the place where I think I have a story to tell and I'm tracing my decision making backwards. It really is when we joined that church that my childhood changed, my life changed, my parents and family dynamic changed. Everything um is different. And so I think my first 10 years they were spent on a farm in Michigan where we sometimes went to church, very
Mhm.
Midwestern, very family oriented, very nature dominant. I think that is very formative for my character. But my story really begins when we joined the megachurch, which is First Baptist downtown Jacksonville, Florida in
Mhm.
1984.
Yeah. So, paint me a picture of this church that you went to in Florida.
Yeah, so it's really more of an arena than a church building. I had been used to like the narrow church with the pews and the cross in
Mhm.
the front and a little stage and a choir loft. This was a circular arena with red upholstery, red carpet, a big giant waterfall, stone waterfall above the baptistry on the stage. We had huge TV lights in all over the ceilings because we were on TV. We were one of the first televised stadium type arena mega churches. If you've seen Old Time Gospel Hour was on at the time with Jerry Falwell, and our pastors were buddies. So um,
Right.
very similar. We had a sign language lady in the corner of our church, but we didn't have her on the screen like
Yeah.
like Falwell did.
Right. And this was new for you. Like you guys really hadn't gone to church before and your mom loved it, your dad loved it, but you didn't
Mhm.
love it and you felt like you had no friends.
Yeah, my parents grew up pretty mainstream religious. My dad had been through Catholic school and was kind of lapsed. My mom grew up pretty strict evangelical free and did go to church very regularly, and she wanted that for our family. But we were as likely to go out for breakfast on Sunday or be working hard because there was something that needed to get done as we were to go to Sunday school before that. So it was like present in my life, and I have church memories and I have some early church trauma from Sunday school teachings and hell and things like that that happened at a
Mhm.
very young age. But it was not the total immersion lifestyle that we encounter in Jacksonville.
Right. And even at that start when you're telling this story, it's quite clear that you felt responsible for doing things that you didn't want to do or like doing so that your family
Yeah.
did better.
That's a family dynamic that would have
Mhm.
been true, I think, regardless of our religious
Yeah.
influence. I um I've always been a very visible, active, aware, a present person. So like I was born with a tooth. Like I kind of arrived to the planet like I'm in the room is
Right.
true of me.
Hmm.
And I've always been like very sensitive and aware that my choices impact the people around me, and I want their love, and I really want like I think I was born a people pleaser. I just really have a tendency to fawn and people please as part of my personality type.
Right. So you're going to this church. So you're not really enjoying. You have no friends. You're having stress, like physical stress symptoms. You're seeing the doctor for because you have no friends. Here you are,
Mm,
prepubescent adolescent kid. Um,
yeah.
and then the church. A lot of the teachings at the church actually sounded quite traumatic. Like some of the things
Yeah.
that they were teaching. Can you tell us some of that?
Yes. So I think what's important to like pull back the camera a little bit and recognize that in the evangelical church movement, especially in the South, from the 80s to the 90s, which is my maturation arc, is also that church is becoming more fundamentalist and more politicized at the same rate. So as I'm aging, the teaching is really becoming more intense and it's drilling down on control. So modesty, this shows up in modesty culture, purity culture. We had men guarding the door, measuring our skirt lengths coming in. We had a lot of sexualized fear teachings to make sure that we stayed virgins, a lot of shame, analogies and metaphors. We had pastors that had absolutely no sexual boundaries in what they preached on. So I received a lot of really janky sex education from the pulpit, which was really just it was R-rated. They were R-rated sermons, and I had no business in them as a child, but they were our youth group sermons at camp. Like it we
Yes.
yeah. It was also during
Yeah.
the AIDS crisis and the Clinton presidency, and Murphy Brown was on TV and she was having a child out of wedlock. And so there were all these like cultural pressures and things being preached on that that lead a sensitive, observant child to take note of, okay, there's one way to be a woman and there's another way to be a woman, and one of these gets you
Mhm.
eternal security.
Right. Right. And as you painted different pictures of the messages that you got at camp, I remember how if you use a tampon, you're not a virgin anymore,
Yeah.
but you can pray to get your virginity back after using a tampon. Like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
Yes, revirgining. I really tried to get my head around that. It didn't really work, but yeah, my friend just got so upset because I had tried to use a tampon and she was convinced I'd taken my own virginity.
Right. Oh my
Just I really
goodness.
didn't
Um,
understand.
we did a podcast a while ago called The Myth of the Magic Penis, and it just like seriously, I will put a link in because y'all need to listen to that because this it kind of relates, but it's just nuts. Um, the other thing I noticed as you're telling all these vignettes is that even though the teaching and you ended up at some Gothard, Bill Gothard summer camps and even as the teaching got more and more extreme, you honestly were trying to follow it. Like
Yeah, I
you
was.
you you were trying like you were desperately trying to find the rules so that you could be a good girl and make everybody happy. But at
Yeah,
the same time you weren't happy.
right.
You had these dreams and I loved the teachers that you told
Mm.
about who really encouraged you with your writing and your art.
Yes. Well, that was, I went to public school. Homeschooling hadn't quite taken the hold that it has. It wasn't such an option. I only knew one homeschooler growing up, and she ended up becoming my midwife, and she was a Gothard homeschooler. So that was the only homeschooler we knew when I was a young person. And so I went to public school, and I had other influences and teachers, and so I was really able to kind of straddle those worlds and realize that, oh, in the world you have talents and skills and you're expected to develop them and become someone. Like
Mhm.
public school was expecting that I would use my intelligence and my talents to better society and increase my worldview. And the opposite was true at church. I was expected to suppress all of my talents and gifts unless I could find a spiritual enough outlet for them and become just a wife and mother. And I happen to really want to be a wife and mother. So I didn't necessarily have a problem with that. I
Mhm.
just knew that I come from people who can do more. Like you can do it all.
Mhm.
I had a wife, and my mom was a wife and mother, and she was an artist and a seamstress and entrepreneur and, really great helper to my dad. And my dad was also an entrepreneur and builder. So I came from high capacity, and that idea that I needed to limit what I was born with was
Mhm.
really difficult for me to put into a box. That was a very large struggle of my adolescence.
Yeah. And then, yeah, it is heartbreaking. And so
Yeah.
there you are. You're this little girl who's desperately trying to follow the rules, but you also really want this art outlet. And you think, well, maybe I can go to Bible college and use my art for God, but
Mhm.
there's no money for Bible college.
Right.
And
And
your
it wasn't
parent,
that expensive. Like really, it was a year
Mhm.
at the Word of Life Bible Institute. I think maybe it was $2,000 for the whole year. It really wasn't that much. And my church would not help me. My parents would not help me. It no one valued it that, like you don't
Mhm.
need it. You're going to have babies. You're going to have a good enough job to get you to your marriage. You don't need any education.
But what the church told you though, because you actually it is heartbreaking, and
Yeah,
I wrote it down. I wrote it down. So you go in and you talk to the pastor because they do have scholarships to send
they do.
the
And yeah,
youth to Bible college. And the pastor said to you, "Well, young lady, we use our precious dollars to assist men called into the ministry. We don't spare that money for girls."
right, right.
Yep.
And he was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm not going to argue with that.
Right. Right. So there you are, and you really have no options. You have nothing that you can do except to
Mhm.
wait to be a wife and a mother.
Right.
And so you're young, you have a couple of dating experiences that don't go well, and then you meet Alan.
Yeah. And meeting Alan was quick and swift, and I had been groomed to accept quick and swift. We were very encouraged to have short engagements, marry people that we did not know that well, and trust things like young people will figure it out. Um,
Mhm.
God will bless your innocence. It was just this constant inundation of messaging that what mattered is that we were virgins on our wedding day, and that nature and biology and attraction would eventually come. We were we this is the kind of church where Elizabeth Elliot comes and talks to us. We didn't just read her books, Passion and Purity. We actually see her on stage, and she's interacting with us. And that's so the message that you can meet somebody and not know them very well and marry them seemed like peas and carrots, just completely ordinary.
Right.
No red flags in
But
marrying.
you did see some red flags while you were dating him.
I saw
And
some things I didn't like and didn't wasn't sure about what to do. I had no one to talk to honestly about that at all at this point. I was 19, and we talked about the tampon story. That close
Mhm.
friend that I had, like she was my closest friend, and she was very fundamentalist by this point, very locked into the aesthetic and the imagery of the easy formula. The very clear formula was very attractive to her. If you do this and this and this, then you'll get that. And um, so I
Which I
did. I
find
did.
so interesting. I do need to say that
Yeah,
is totally the prosperity gospel. And
it
yet
is.
these churches would say that they don't believe the prosperity gospel, but that is totally the prosperity gospel.
Well, Rick Warren and his stuff was like really on the scene at that time. And so we were
Yeah.
like prosperity gospel light. I mean, people were reading it from the Christian bookstore, and we were definitely paying attention to that, and it was getting in there. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's also like marketing and branding going on here. Like our pastors had their own brand, um and there's just so many. It's complex. It really is
Yeah.
complex when these are businesses, and nobody can really pastor thousands of people, but they have a structure in place, and
Yeah.
there's like different kinds of pastors at every level. Some of those pastors were in the IBLP, and we had the church within the church. And then other of those pastors were much more compassionate, tender people who just really love Jesus and want to do what's right in a loving way. So it's all in the same environment. It made you very not sure of who to trust and who to turn to.
Right. So there you are, you're dating this guy, and everyone tells you, look, you should just get married. And
Mhm.
this is all you've been groomed for.
Right.
Like you tried to do something else, and every other path was shut to you. And it was
Mhm.
expected this is supposed to be your life. You're supposed to get married and have kids. And so you're waiting. And then Alan shows up, and other people tell you, yeah, he's the one. This is great. But let
Yeah.
me just read some of the things you said that he did, like the day that he threatened to behead me by driving us under a semi truck and begging to have sex before the wedding, the night he promised to drive us off the Acosta Bridge, and the way the back of my head hurt because he so often pulled my hair. I kept secrets like black rose petals, a bridal bouquet of shadows. So all this
Mhm.
stuff is going on, and nobody told you you're allowed to like the guy you marry. You don't have to marry someone you don't like.
You know, Sheila, that's something I hear through your work. And every time you say it, every time you talk about marriage and she deserves better and all of that, younger me listens and is so grateful that this is a conversation we get to have now because there was none of that back then. It was just blindly trust in the institution of marriage. That would be safety and you would be okay. Blindly trust that this God entity was going to protect you and that bad outcomes happen to other people, but not you. And then there was no talk of, well, what might it look like if you're on the wrong path? Or what might it look like if you're in a dangerous situation? So
Right.
after 18 years of complete grooming to internalize every situation as my fault, and I'm really at that point, like you picked up on it when I was 10, that really has stayed with me that if something is broken or wrong, it must be my fault. It must be something that I can improve. And so when those
Mhm.
violent situations were happening, every single time I internalized it as, well, it's because of what I did, that he did that and I'll do better next time. And then he won't get as angry and it won't get that far. And, that was our dance already. And that
Mhm.
was what he was telling me. He was always blaming me for his lack of control. So um, that was the setup.
Right. And then as soon as you were married,
Mm.
the, the rape on your wedding night is just horrific and on your honeymoon.
It
And
is. Do you know that I still talk to people who read that they've read advanced copies and there's been two instances where the man is like, well, it wasn't rape, right? It was just rough sex. You weren't ready for the rough sex.
oh
Like,
my
are we still
goodness.
there? We are still there. That's why it's important to have these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're begging him to stop because you were in pain. He wouldn't stop.
Mm.
Um, and then you actually ended up having to go to a doctor in the
Yeah.
first week of your marriage
Yeah. I
because
had a
you were
really
so
bad infection.
infection. Yeah.
Yeah. That's how I learned that it was assault because the doctor was actually horrified with what he found. And he
Hmm.
would have done a rape kit if he hadn't have known that I was married. My fiance, my husband, I guess at the time was in the next room.
Right.
Yeah.
I if you're a doctor listening to this or a nurse or anyone who if someone's got injuries from
Mhm.
sex, that's not normal. Like,
Right.
please, like, investigate that. And yeah, because over and over
You know,
again in your story, you saw counselors who told you, like, who knew the whole story and who still said you've just got to submit more. Like, you saw professionals at different points in your life
I did.
who could see these little snippets of your life, and people didn't step in and help.
They didn't. That increased the reason why I stayed because I knew I didn't have anywhere to turn. Every time I risked honesty or bared myself in a transparent way, their approach was what is needed to keep the marriage together. Their
Hmm.
approach was not to keep me safe, to even speak the truth to me. So the doctor's a great example. He recognizes what happened, and his go-to is to scold my husband to make sure that I get a week off. He didn't
Right.
tell me you've been raped, you're in danger, you should go home to your parents. Like he didn't say any of those things to me. It was
Hmm.
just get some Desitin for your bottom and let me talk to your husband.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know what he said to him. What he said to him was enough to stop sex for a while, but I
Hmm.
don't know what he said to him that day.
Yeah. And then this wasn't the only kind of abuse that started in your marriage. He would criticize you, he would hit you, he
Mm.
demanded perfection with housekeeping, and would just if there was any problem, which he would just make stuff up,
Right.
he would use it as an
Create.
excuse. Yeah, use it
Mhm.
as an excuse to yell at you and hit you, and then in the middle of all this, I loved this. I mean, love is the wrong word, but I'm like, yep, there it is. Um, as things get worse, he would apologize because abusers do that, right? Like they abuse and then they
Right.
apologize. He says, wait, I have the answer. We just
Yeah.
need complementarian gender roles. And I have this great book by John Piper, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood.
Yeah. There was always a book. Like
Mhm.
that starts a process in line. And I hope this comes through in my work that these books all lead one to another. Each pastor
Mhm.
leads to another. They are not little vacuums and in tiny chambers of separation. It is a mass that you are taking in. And it forms a congregation, it forms a wall that you can't penetrate. The Piper solution was, supposed to be the thing until it wasn't, until we needed the next, narrowing thing. But the things that John Piper says about domestic abuse are horrible.
Yeah.
They're disgusting.
Yep. Yeah. And we've
Yeah.
said some of that on this podcast. I'll put links to some of those podcasts where how John Piper handles abuse, which is atrocious.
Yeah.
But as you're reading all of these other books, because you're desperately trying to fix this marriage, you're desperately trying to find, the one thing that will help. Tell me about the voice that you were told to have. What do you call it?
Oh, the
Fundy.
Fundy baby voice.
Yes, I laughed at this part. I'm like, oh yes, I know Tia. Yeah, the Fundy baby
Yes.
voice.
This is part of the wider teaching, and it's so alive and well in the trad wife movement right now. And I'm like, you guys think you made this up? You think this is new? This is not new.
Mhm.
No. So in the complementarian role, you have the woman is, of course, she's imbued with all her natural gifts that are somehow on par and equal to his, but they're different. And so she's supposed to be very feminine. And so this pursuit of femininity involves vocal training. It also involves like the way you laugh, the way you sit, the way you dress. Can't wear plaids. You need to wear pink, be very feminine at all times. And it's really grooming that what we would see today is the trad wife image, very, very feminine and soft and lovely. And it is supposed to be reflected in your voice as well. So you begin this training where you learn to control your laugh, ever speak too loudly. And at the worst of it, it's the Michelle Duggar baby voice. It's
It
you
is. Yeah.
want to sound childlike, you want to sound sweet and innocent because it is a coaxing, gentle way to get somebody to do what you want, but it's also submissive and unthreatening and very obvious sign of deference. So it's for me now, it's a trigger of high control. When I hear it, I know that women are using that to manipulate because that's what it is. It's a vocal manipulation. And I've worked so hard to retrain my voice to its natural sound.
Mhm.
It's kind of like what I'm doing with my hair right now. I'm retraining my curls to come back. I did the same thing with my voice, like you just, um, the Fundy baby voice is what the outsiders are calling it now because of Katie Britt's State of the Union response. And it
Right.
sums up the Amy Coney Barrett uses it on the Supreme Court, and Michelle Duggar, of course. And we hear pastors' wives sound this way, and lots of Christian women sound this way, and it's so cultural that it's hard to tease apart. Well, where did this begin? And there's a little bit of confusion in the 60s because the Marilyn Monroe baby doll era also coincides with the Feminine Mystique coming out and the Fascinating Womanhood book that was the counter. They came out at the same time in 1963, the Feminine Mystique and Fascinating Womanhood. Fascinating Womanhood was a Mormon book. It's still in print today. They're still alive and well online. They have spin-off books like Fascinating Girlhood and a UK reach that I just discovered that I'm so disturbed about. Because in the UK and in Australia, those are mission fields for the fundamentalists right now. Yeah, but it's all from that, and it's both and it influenced the culture, and it's also Southern, and it's also intentional
Mhm.
femininity training in the church.
Right, because if a woman, a grown adult woman is talking like a child,
Mm.
then it really it lets everybody know this man is over me. I
Yes,
am under
and I
him.
am
I
no
am being
threat.
submissive. I am no threat. Yeah. And so you
Mhm.
don't actually get to be yourself.
Not at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Not
It's
Yeah, not even in private.
it's absolutely awful. One of the other sad pictures that I got at this point in your marriage. So you're early married, you're really trying to be perfect so you don't set him off. You get pregnant, you're excited about having a baby. Um,
Mhm.
but the work that you did, and you were so worried that the baby would cry because
Mm.
then your husband would abuse the baby. And so you were trying so desperately to figure out how to get the baby not to cry and to sleep through the night. And I just thought,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, the fear you must have had.
It's I didn't know what he would do. And what I assumed he would do is hurt me for not because that was his pattern of punishing me for something that he thought was under my control and me not doing a very good job of it. That would be the thing I'd get in trouble for. And there were a lot of levels I was afraid, like if I was holding a baby and he got hurt, um or just that that would be his mom, that my son would grow up seeing his mom hurt. I didn't want that either. I didn't want the abuse. I didn't want the pain. I think the word I would have used is pain, because I didn't really call it abuse until after I was out. I knew that being a good wife and mother, it meant having cooperative, well-trained children. And I needed to figure that out. That was my first test, is your baby screaming all night? Um, which was ironic looking back at it, because I was already very well skilled in infant care. I was confident. I'd been a nanny and a babysitter for years, and I had no qualms about that. I am naturally nurturing and maternal, and I think I have a very reasonable expectation that newborns are going to cry. That's what they do, because
Mhm.
that's how they communicate. So I think it would have been absolutely fine in a normal situation, but for me, it was terror. It was, Moses
Mhm.
basket level of terror. I've got to keep my baby quiet in order to keep my family safe.
Yeah, I have a 4-month-old granddaughter at the moment,
Mm,
and I love her to pieces. She's just lovely. But
mm,
she went through that 4-month sleep regression, and 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 we had Katie was staying with me, and we had a couple of really rough nights,
yeah.
and I was helping with that. But yeah, like they're babies.
They're babies.
They're
They're
babies.
babies. They're biologically unable to do the thing that fundamentalism asks of them, demands of them. The whole Baby Wise program, and it was the pilot program for preparation for parenting at the time, which
Hmm.
became Growing Kids God's Way and then Baby Wise, and which sets the stage for the rest of the fundamentalist parenting books, that
Hmm.
come on down the line. But um, that idea that a newborn should sleep 12 hours a night without waking. It's just not even biologically how they're made. Everything suffers, their weight gain, their blood sugar, all of it.
Hmm.
And attachment wounds, like we didn't have attachment wound theory, back then,
Right.
but we know it now, and we can see the fruit of it. Like that, and that that's the important conversation to have, is what is the fruit of
Yeah.
these teachings?
Yeah. And I mean, you're so young and you had a number of kids close together and it seems like you were doing a really good job. Like, you're really caring for them and you're the one who's bearing the brunt of the abuse.
Yeah,
But
right.
at how are you getting more into I know IBLP, you started with IBLP around that time. How,
Yes, well,
how'd you get
Titus
indoctrinated
too.
into that? Yeah, what happened?
Titus too. I was in this church, and in IBLP, so it's important to back up and say that Bill Gothard's evangelistic method was to spread within churches. So people would come to his conferences for the biblical principles, and they would come from all different denominations. It was not just a Baptist thing. It was not even just an evangelical thing. They would come there to study the Bible and learn these basic life principles that would organize your life and lead to happy families and happy marriages. And that is always, I think, the attraction of fundamentalist thinking, is that there is a formula and an ideal that if you follow this plan, you will get this result.
Hmm.
And so these are very earnest, sincere, well-meaning people who are spending their money and their time, and they're devoting their entire lifestyles to this. And so the result of that was a church within a church. We had kind of an IBLP stronghold growing at First Baptist, and these large families were spreading. Homeschooling was growing as a movement. We had conventions in the city at that point, and so it's really taking root. And so I'm a young mom, 20 years old, and I have a newborn and I have a desperate situation. And so I do what I was taught to do, which is ask an older woman for advice. And
Hmm.
because I'm smart and I want a professional, I look for a mom who has really done this a lot. And so I find a mom with 10 children, who's networked with another group of mothers who all have big families. And I know this is who I can take advice from. These are not women who like did it once or twice. They've done it 10, 12 times, and I can trust their advice. And so that is how I end up with a group of women I call my Gothard Fundie mentors, because they were all IBLP women, which to me felt like the giant reveal. I had been trying to find out the special rules to a happy Christian life my whole life. And when I discovered the Gothard women, I was like, aha, these are the special rules I needed to know in order to really have assurance of my salvation and really feel like I was doing the Christian life well. So it felt like a score. It felt like, okay,
Hmm.
here's the answer to all my problems. And they did have an answer for every single problem. They had a solution, they had a wisdom booklet, they had scripture, they had a whole plan, they had professional pastors, they had books. There was always an answer for every single problem. Who doesn't love that?
Yeah, but every single answer was you're doing it wrong and you just need to try harder
Right.
and not matter as much.
Right. Oh, the suffering and the way life closes down so quickly. It just became small and ugly and harsh and fascist and authoritarian. And that just gets worse as we go through the story, because
Yeah.
that is how fundamentalism actually works. That's the actual fruit of fundamentalism.
Yeah, and I want to stress something that you're saying here, just so that our listeners really understand, is that this fundamentalism, it's not that you were going to a super fundamentalist church at this point. You would
Right.
later, but at this point you
Right.
were not. You were
Right.
going to like a regular run-of-the-mill church, but there
Mhm.
were people in there who were indoctrinating you for IBLP. And this is why pastors and women's ministry leaders, if you do not speak against this stuff, it does spread in your church. So,
Right.
and we found this in our survey for Great Sex Rescue as well. Like when we asked women, where were you taught these toxic teachings? We didn't call them toxic teachings because in the survey, but like where were you taught these things? The teachings that we later named as toxic because of their effects on people, the majority of people said that it wasn't from their pastor. It wasn't from
Right.
sermons.
Right.
You know, it was from these small groups of women, or it was from media organizations like Focus on the Family,
Right.
and then into some of the even more fundamentalist ones. So it's like you could be the best pastor in the world giving the greatest information. But if
Mhm.
in your congregation this stuff is spreading and you are not speaking directly against it, then people are going to end up in abusive relationships.
That is so important because that's the system of accountability. So when I would definitely agree with what you just said completely. It was the Sunday school teachers that had been to a Gothard conference who came back to their church willing to serve and willing to take on leadership positions that needed to be filled. What pastor's not going to say no to that? You know, here's a
Hmm.
very upstanding person. The IBLP families had a lot of respect in our church because they were willing to make lifestyle adaptations the rest of the church was not. They were
Right.
willing to sacrifice and live, the harder life for Jesus, have the many children, do the things like people donated cars to them and helped them build their homes and sent them grocery money because they could see their obvious poverty. They were revered, and there was no system of accountability, so that the young marrieds class was being taught by a fundamentalist, and our pastor was probably just really glad to have that position filled.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
didn't wasn't aware of the ideas that were spreading,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure would have questioned them at that point, but um, I feel for, like, if I take myself out of it and I imagine a pastor today concerned about the conservatism that's happening in a corner of their church, that rub of, well, if I push too hard, I'm going to lose
Hmm.
this person, and now I'm going to have a faculty gap. I get it. I understand why
Hmm.
that's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But people's lives are literally depending on this. Like
You
this
have
is,
to value people over ideas. That's
yes,
that's I hope
yes,
they
you
put that on
do.
my grave.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
value people over ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so your life is getting worse and worse and worse. And then, let's see if I can get through this part. And then we
Mm,
come to the
mm.
sisterhood that you and I share.
Yeah.
And I've never met anyone else that I share this with.
It's eerie how similar these stories are.
Yeah. So
So I just take a gift.
yeah, your fourth
Yeah.
child,
Third.
yours was a girl. Oh, your third. I'm sorry.
Third.
Your third child was a girl,
Mm-hmm.
Clara,
Mm-hmm.
and she was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which is a very severe congenital heart defect,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is fatal if not treated with surgery. But the surgery doesn't necessarily cure it; it just prolongs someone's life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and your daughter went through the Norwood procedure just like my son Christopher did. And,
Mm-hmm.
I remember emailing you right after I read that part of the book and just like, oh my gosh, I was just sobbing because I've never, if I open up my diary, like the
Mm-hmm.
thoughts that you shared, even when you said, handing her over to go to surgery and how that felt, not knowing if you were going to get her back. And I remember that moment where I handed my little 5-pound little baby boy
Mm-hmm.
over to the anesthetist. Um,
Yeah.
yes.
You don't know if you're going to get what you're going to get back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I was really careful, obviously, with that part of the book, but for many reasons. The entire experience took me out of the world that I was in, and that's really important to the overall impact that it had. Um, Clara absolutely changed my life, and I always talk about her because she is a space maker. Every time I tell her story, I
mhm,
open a space for someone else to share theirs, and that is needed. That is always
mhm.
like that is needed. I hear so many stories because I am willing to say Clara's name and tell her story, but I also can't, like, I'm not here without Clara. Like she cracked me open. She broke a spell I was
Mhm.
under.
Yeah. Yeah. And so both of us have little babies who hopefully are together in heaven,
I know, I love
having
that
fun and
image. I
looking
really do.
down on us. Um, but it was with Clara that you finally
Mm.
advocated for yourself. That
Yeah,
was when
I didn't know
something.
that word before the hospital, but a friend again, like I have this thing I say in Shiny Happy People, that the universe will catch you. And this that really is one of the fingerprints throughout my story. And in the hospital, that's one of those that there, as soon as I'm there, there's these moms who are also going through the same thing with their children. And I was blessed with some other heart moms who'd been there before. They'd had ongoing situations with their kids. And so they kind of without a religious agenda behind it, but just out of pure love for my humanity and care for me, helped me survive that atmosphere. And that's how I learned that hospitals have advocates and that that's a word you can use and that's a thing you can do for yourself. And um, yeah, I mean, what power. It was a key.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you say that she changed things. Tell me what she changed after she died, and that
Yeah,
obviously grief changes you forever.
it
Um,
does.
but there's more to it than that, I think.
Yeah, Clara. I had not lost anyone before. But Clara was my first loss, my first personal funeral. Um, what she did, like, it's so hard. Like, I've put it into words, and then it's also hard to put into words because it is a profound altering of my DNA, altering of my psyche. I could not be who I was before her. Um, Sometimes I think about the fact that her name is a C, like BC. Before Clara, I am one person, and after Clara, I am another person. And the expectation of my religious environment was that I would go back to being who I always was. I would come back into this context and I would continue to procreate. I would grieve an allowed, appropriate amount of time, but then I would move on and would not give in to any kind of emotionalism. I would cap it, I would suppress it. I couldn't. It was not a matter of whether or not I was going to comply with it. I was and still am to this day completely unable to go back to a world where Clara did not exist. And that is not just the impact of her life, that is also
Mhm.
because I won't do that to her life and memory. What we went through was so profound that I think the greatest disservice that we do for our dead is act as if they didn't exist. And I'm not capable of that at all. So that meant the new world had to accommodate some very uncomfortable truths, some very dissonant truths. Like it tapped into our theology immediately. Like there was no, it was just different. It was going to be different. Now I really drilled down and tried even more to be a life honoring Christian wife and mother at this point, and it did teach me how to ad- advocate and stand up for joy and the value of life. I really
Mhm.
leaned into gratitude to be alive. You know, being life is not something to take for granted. And it did make some years better afterward. But that's like through with me. Like when I start shining, it's like I know I'm a shiny person. When I start
Mhm.
shining, it's after Clara and it's in honor of her and it's always with her. Like um there's no just Tia here. Like there's a kaleidoscope and Clara's part of the
Mhm.
kaleidoscope. And um yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, no,
she
I know
changed
what you
me.
mean. I wouldn't be doing this
Yeah,
without Christopher either. It put me on a completely
yeah,
different, yeah, I see life differently and yeah. And I think it was at
yeah.
those moments too where you start to realize the emptiness and the utter. callousness of so many of the religious people around you with the stupid things they say. And I know a lot of people say stupid things because they don't know what to say. I know that. But
Right.
there are people who say stupid things because they truly believe them.
Yes. Yes. And they also have they couple that with no compassion.
Yeah.
They're used to having a trite and pat answer and a platitude, and that is how they get through their lives. And that is what they will apply to yours. And grief is a great eraser. It just takes it all
Mhm.
away. And I was unfiltered for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and then when you, and it seems like, you were in contact with these other heart moms. You got in contact with other people online, and so now is the time when you start almost living two lives because you've got your
Yes.
kids and your husband, and there's still abuse, and you're trying to be this perfect Christian wife, but
Mhm.
you've also got this other support group online that isn't Christian.
Well, they were Christian originally because we
Uh-huh.
met on the Sunlight Curriculum Board, which is a
Oh,
Christian
okay.
curriculum
Yes.
board.
Uh-huh.
And so they were different kinds of Christians. They were progressive, they were Catholic, they were Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians. They were from all these backgrounds, which I had had no experience with before. And so I got to see that Christianity had flavors.
Mhm.
And I think that this part of my story is so relevant for the conversation that we have around Instagram life versus real life today. There are women with two lives all over the place. We mask, we have coping mechanisms, we have categories, we compartmentalize all of these things. A lot of us are holding secrets that we, don't share online, and we're am I allowed to cuss on here? I say I say we're shining up the shit, like we're trying to make our ugly lives more attractive and beautiful and aesthetic because we also want to see beauty in our life. And if we'd had social media in this part of the story, I would have been all over Instagram. Blogging
Mhm.
wasn't there yet. The internet wasn't quite there. Forums had just started, which is where I find this trapdoor of women, this group of women who love to learn and self-discover, and they're growing. We didn't want to talk about like stain remedies and housekeeping. We wanted to talk about the great books and the ideas that we were having. And most of them started out as theological arguments. We did a lot of fighting about
Mhm.
theology because we had a place where we could talk about it. We weren't really allowed to do that in
Mhm.
our churches and homeschools and all of that.
Yeah. I love that. I love how God gave you this group of people who led you down this path where you're starting to use gifts, but at home, things are getting more fundamentalist. I mean, you weren't even allowed to vote,
Right. That's
which
correct.
is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and your husband's getting more and more into the reformed movement,
Hmm.
um, which again is not bad. Like this is separate from what
Right.
you were in before. And he starts reading Doug Wilson
Yeah.
and Federal Husband.
Who is still a very prominent voice in patriarchy today. In fact, I think he's stronger than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he was big and scary, and he's my chief villain in my story. And this is 20 years ago. Um, and he's stronger than ever today. And the voting thing, he floated it this week. He brought up head of household voting just this week on Instagram and released a reel. So while it is crazy, it is their agenda. They don't believe that women should have the vote. And
Yeah.
um, just like they've peeled our other rights back. They went for abortion first, and then they went to divorce. They're talking about divorce more and more openly, and voting is right behind it. So it is a regression and an
Mm-hmm.
agenda.
And this part of the book might really shock people. It didn't me because I've heard this before, but your husband actually got into domestic discipline. And
Yes, this is the domestic discipline is something that happens more often than people realize. My
hmm
my inbox has always got Me Too's in it when I talk about it, which is every interview now. Um, It does happen. It is not in every home. And what I hope to accomplish with this conversation is to make sure everyone knows it does happen. It's the
hmm
natural conclusion in many of the stories of the books that we were using. Wilson does not ever come out on the page and say that husbands should spank their wives, but he says all of the supporting things that would get you there.
hmm
And when you couple it with Michael Pearl's work and the other fundamentalist teachers in the books about staying with someone who hurts you and who is hitting you, and like it's just an entire atmosphere that's important to look at and consider the environment, the petri dish, and that this is an outcome, a logical outcome.
Yeah. And the idea of a husband having the right to spank their wife if their wife disobeys them or does
Mhm.
something wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not necessarily in these books, but it is spread from man to man, church to church among people who read these books. And it's actually quite common. I get a lot of emails about it. Um,
Mm.
you definitely hear about it in especially very conservative reformed circles. It is a thing.
Mhm.
And I don't want to give too much information because I don't want people looking for it, but like
Right.
there's
Don't go Googling.
no, please don't. And we're not talking about erotic spanking, although that has issues too. Like this is
Right.
actually treating you like a child, although I don't think children should be spanked either.
Right.
But yeah, to punish you
The
and discipline.
justification for it is Douglas Wilson's federal marriage mindset, which he does lay out, that a husband is responsible in the feudal way for to answer to God for everything that happens in his household, including his wife's thoughts and deeds. And so, if he's going to face her behavior, account for her behavior on Judgment Day, he has to find a way to keep her under control.
Mhm,
And so like men swap ideas the same way women swap recipes, like we're all talking
mhm,
about, oh, how did you get your baby to sleep at night? How do you get your wife to obey? Here's how I
mhm,
did it. That's it's that casual. Um,
mhm.
and because these groups are gendered and private and sequestered off, sometimes behind paywalls, men's groups are, we don't know what goes on in there any more than they really know what goes on in ours, except ours, we're afraid to say things out loud. So
Yeah.
ours are probably not so scandalous. And they're really banking on it being too embarrassing for people to talk about. And I don't play that way.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna tell. It happened to me. It was awful, and I'm gonna tell because it's happening to other women who I know can't say it. They don't have a voice. I've done the work to say it without re-traumatizing myself, so I can say this
Mhm,
happened to me and this does happen, and then you can send me a DM and say me too, and it's enough to keep me feeling like absolutely I need to keep talking about this.
mhm.
Um, Interestingly enough, the BDSM community gets upset when they hear about Christian domestic discipline because they use consent
Yeah.
and they have safe words and they have practices for aftercare, and it's very clearly boundaried in a sexual practice. And that is not what Christian domestic discipline is at all. Um,
Mhm.
all blurry, no boundaries, no consent, no safe words.
Right. So paint me a picture, and you do in the book of a time where your husband wanted to or decided that you needed punishment.
So there's some setup involved in that you have to have a contract that won't hold him. You can't be calling the police and say he hit you. So there's some things you put in writing first. There's agreed upon process and
And let me
implementation.
just say, even if you put that in writing, you can still call the
Yeah, you can.
police.
Yes.
Okay, please. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The contract is a coercive technique to make you silent. It's
Mm-hmm.
to make you embarrassed. And it worked on me because I imagined that if he had that contract written in my handwriting, which is how it has to be, that a judge would not take me seriously. I believed him. So it kept me under control. It was a psychological control method and it worked. But you can still report it as violence. It is still abuse.
Mm-hmm.
It is still wrong, and they will still help you. Um and so the stage is set. There's agreed upon rules. There's this is not it's like it's not just spanking, like I had to say, yes, my lord.
Yeah.
We'd had that conversation. I had to call him my lord, which Doug Wilson does talk about that too. So does Martha Peace and The Excellent Wife. I mean, that language
Mhm.
is in multiple books, um, which all just builds upon one another. And then when you've done something wrong, there's a process of accountability, and um, it looks just like spanking a child or an older daughter. I hear from older daughters who were homeschooled, into until they were married, because they're part of the stay-at-home daughter movement, and they share
Mhm.
about being spanked as young women by their fathers, and it is the same. It's the same position. It's an implement, and it's a spanking.
Yeah. And it has nothing like it is just abusive. It is wrong. Please, please, please. If you know anyone who's going through this, call the authorities. And if you are going through this, please call a domestic violence hotline because this should not be happening to you. It isn't okay. And even if they said, well, you agreed to it, or you had to write the contract, when you're being coerced to write that contract, it means nothing. It
Right.
means nothing. You
You're
cannot
not
consent
really,
to your own
unless you're free to
abuse.
say no. Unless you're free
Mhm.
to say no, you're not free to say yes. And if I had
Exactly.
said no to that, I would have been beaten. So I wasn't free to say yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't real consent.
So while all this is happening though, you're still really trying to raise your kids right. And
Hmm.
you're also taking responsibility for your husband's behavior. Like you're thinking, okay, how can I help him grow? And I
I
saw
want to
that
be a good
so
helpmeet.
much.
Let's not
Yeah.
forget Debbie Pearl. Like,
Yes. Yes.
I was really trying to be a good helpmeet. I was
Mhm.
also having more babies and I had lost a child. So I was very invested in keeping what I would call then my stress level down, what I would call now my anxiety and cortisol down, because cortisol
Mhm.
is not something you don't want to grow a baby in a pool of cortisol soup in your body, which I'm sure I had going all the time. And I felt very responsible for Clara's defect. So I was highly motivated to keep the peace at all
Mhm.
costs, including, my body, okay. This is
Yeah.
this is dying to myself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just tragic. And then you get more and more into fundamentalism. You actually move to a whole other community
Yeah.
where tell us about that. I mean, it's just so crazy. But yeah, tell
So if
us
you're
about that.
wondering at this point, like what these churches are, we start at Southern Baptist Megachurch. We go to a small Southern Baptist community that was part of the family integrated church movement, um, then an independent Baptist, then a PCA Presbyterian, then a Reformed Presbyterian, then a Covenant Reformed Presbyterian. And that Covenant Reformed Presbyterian church was in Tennessee. Um, and that was the Doug Wilson, Doug Phillips Vision Forum,
Mhm.
congregation of like minds, where we had to actually sign a covenant of membership and would be excommunicated if we ever wanted to leave. We knew that going into it.
Right. And t the other women, what were their lives like?
They looked a lot like my mentors in IBLP, although I had stepped away from the IBLP after Clara. The movement had reflected that now. So like the homeschooling movement was now classical homeschooling and the reformed tradition. And so it just looked like that whole world got bigger. So not so much like I left it, more like it spread and now it was all around me. Kind of like what it feels like now with having risked my life and everything to escape it. And now my country is turning into it. It was
Mhm.
a little bit like that.
Mhm.
Um, so they looked like model mothers. They baked bread and wore dresses and homeschooled and covered their heads and had rows of shining children. And we worshiped together as families at church. Everyone was like us, except the big difference at Covenant, as far as the church theology went, is that we did not have altar calls or proselytize because we believed that in Calvinism and the elect, and that people would be attracted to us. So new members would come to us. We didn't need to go out and find them.
Yeah,
Um,
Jesus was
that was
wrong, all that,
right.
go out and make disciples. What does he know? Yeah.
Yes, our theology at this point is tulip. So it's,
Right.
we believed in our
Right.
depravity and we believed in election and that we didn't need to do any evangelism because they'll find us if they want to be Christians.
Yeah. You talked about different women that you knew at different points. Like there was one woman who went absolutely crazy and went, what was it, roller skating naked or something?
Oh, that
Or
was, yeah, back at my old church. I heard about her
Mm.
through the grapevine because
Yeah.
we'd had I don't know if you've ever lived in hurricane culture, like hurricane like climate. In Florida, we have them all the time, and they're long events, and the preparation for a hurricane is often maddening. And we had three big storms in a month,
Hmm.
and she in the hurricane plus fundamentalism got to her, and she snapped. And
Right.
women having psychotic break is not that unusual, now
Yeah.
I know, but I was observing it at that point. And the way she broke was to go rollerblading naked through her neighborhood in the
Yeah.
wind. She'd had
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Because you can only keep up this kind of stress and cognitive dissonance for so long. Like when you're trying to keep everything together, but at the same time you're being abused, you can only keep that up
The women were
until something
breaking. They were either
happens.
getting cancer or they were just dying in other ways. There's suicidal, depression, um, involuntary commitments into mental hospitals. Like women were not okay. And the ones that were, quiverful, still having their babies, are having these uterine prolapses, and their health was being compromised because pregnancy is so taxing. You can't have a baby a year over and over and over again without it destroying your body. So
Yeah,
the toll was starting to show at this point in the story. It's
right.
2004 in the timeline.
Yeah. So paint a picture of your life, before you decided to leave. So what was going on then?
That 2 years we were in Tennessee, the 2 years of themselves are pretty distinct. The first year was in this church, and it looks like all the trad wife content you see online now. My days were homeschooling and home cooking and homesteading and American Heritage Girls, which is like Christian Girl Scouts, and we had a Christian Boy Scout troop, and we had at that point I was using the library again, which had been forbidden previously. So it looked very family oriented, 7 days a week. I was finding ways actually to inject literature and joy and art and happiness into our lives. And my husband was working a lot, so he could barely supervise me that first year. And I started blogging and writing because the blog had just come to the world, and
Hmm.
I was out of state, and I needed to update my family. And so I'd started this blog and had a knack for it. So I was quickly successful online. Um, and it just looked like I had kind of the balance down, like I had figured out how to game the system. Um, but the elders at our church really had a problem with that. They didn't want me writing. They didn't want me writing in my name. I needed to use my husband's name, which I fought against. Um, they really just didn't like seeing me come from day one. Just the fact that
And
I
you
dressed.
weren't, let's just say you were not writing, and you were writing like promoting homesteading, homeschooling.
I
You
was.
were basically a trad wife. Like you weren't
Yes.
writing liberal, progressive, anything. You
Mhm.
were proselytizing for trad wives as it
I
was back
really
then.
was. It was
Yeah.
called Living Deliberately, and it was a homesteading,
Hmm.
homeschooling, home oriented,
Yeah.
family oriented project.
Yeah. But this
Mhm.
got you some income because you got good at SEO and
I did. I had a knack for it. My natural talents and gifts started showing back up, and people wanted it, and they were willing to pay me for it. And so I opened my own bank account, and I started making money, and it was just the undoing.
hmm hmm
Yeah.
And how did your husband change over that?
Oh, um, well, not too many spoilers, but at first it was good. The church, when they drilled down control, they moved us into a more isolated place so that I wouldn't have quite so many resources, and he would be home more, so he could do a better job of keeping me in line. Um, and this congregation believed in wife spanking and discipline and all of that, and so that was their mindset, was that he's not home enough, she's getting out of hand, she needs to be controlled. Let's move
Hmm.
them to this town. So they did that, and um, it turns out that men don't like to be told what to do either. And so he started really pushing against having this elder board have so much control in our lives. He wasn't happy with being ordered around. And so we started making move against that. And I went to the library, and I was depressed. I was suicidally depressed at this point. I was so isolated and cut off from everyone. And I was going through this spiritual confrontation of wanting to feel like if God loved me, then I wanted it to know that it was me he loved, not just a shell of a human being with hands and a vagina and a mouth. I wanted it to be Tia that he loved. And so I went to the library to learn about other religions and other expressions of that. And I found Eastern Orthodoxy, which was another flavor again of Christianity that felt really
Hmm.
safe and beautiful because it was historic and rich with art and love and kindness, and a parish mentality was important. It's very simple, again, very traditional. It conveyed safety to me. And I wrote about it. That got me in a lot of trouble with the Presbyterians. Um, so the more they exerted that control and went through the excommunication process for my heresy, we were joined together for a little while. I felt like we were a team for a little window there. because he was excited to get to rebel against them too. He didn't want that control. The flip side of that is that once that external control was removed, he could not cope with life, which was always his problem. He needed external
Mhm.
control in order to cope, and without it, he fell apart and he had his own psychotic snap.
Right, right. And
Mhm.
so what led up to you leaving?
Oh, hell on earth. There's so much I didn't put in the book. um, which is just true. I mean, there's so many things. I will say for memoir, it is not just a progression of all the bad things that happened to you. A good memoir shows how these experiences shaped and formed your life and how you
Mhm.
grew in awareness through them. And so I've curated the scenes that I've included. I had 9 pregnancies and 5 live births and 4 surviving children. And I don't include the miscarriages in the story. I don't include the critically ill son that I had, number 4. I There's whole storylines that are left out. So when we get to the point where he snaps and the months before I leave, the book doesn't fully contain the hell that was to live with someone who is struggling and suffering with extreme untreated mental illness, and we were forbidden doctors. Our minds with theology were still in a way that we don't go to doctors, you don't take medicine, you don't see therapists, you don't deal with any kind of psychotic type
Mhm.
medication or anything like that. Hospitals, all of it was forbidden to us. Even just going to the regular doctor, he didn't want to do. So um, there was no helping him, and he was absolutely over the edge. He saw was convinced we had demons in our home, in our walls. He was becoming addicted, and I didn't realize it because I didn't know what to look for, and he was hiding all of that. So I didn't know I was contending with addiction and binge drinking, and um,
And he had firearms too, which he was
he
threatening
was
with.
armed. Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
he was doing things to kill animals and show all the signs of progression that, like, there are markers when someone is about to um, kill someone, and there are signs that we know to look for now. I knew a little bit to watch. There was a pastor's wife nearby. Her name was Mary Winkler. She shot her husband in her own break. And People Magazine covered her. And I had been reading People Magazine as kind of a private little, what's going on with the world? Let's see what's going
Mhm.
on here. And I read her story, and somebody wrote into People Magazine and said, what's wrong with her? Hadn't she ever heard of divorce? And that line has stuck with me all of these years because that shows how much the outside world does not understand that divorce was not an option for us. We had been conditioned since early childhood that marriage is till death do you part, and if that is at his hand, it is still better than getting a divorce. And so, no, divorce would not have occurred to Mary Winkler as a pastor's wife, and I didn't think it was available to me either. So I was not. I was terrified of these signs that I was experiencing, but I was not thinking that I really had any power to stop them.
Mhm.
Um, it wasn't until we get back to the scene at the beginning of the book where he's hurt my child in a way that I don't want to spoil it, but he's hurt my
Mhm.
child in a way that I can't handle, and I realize it's time to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And you did have some help there.
I did
Yeah.
because I had a plan, and I had reached out to a priest who was going to help me. We didn't get to use that plan the way that we talked about because violence preempted it. But I did have some help. I did have helpers get me
Mhm.
out of the city, out of the state, and out of the marriage.
Yeah. And so, those listening, you might be a helper. You
Yeah,
might be someone who is going to be a helper. So just keep your eyes open. Pray for those opportunities.
yeah,
Um, yeah, where you can help someone escape, where you can keep money for them, where you can keep a bag for them. Um, yeah, pray for those opportunities, so that you don't miss something important that's going on. Because remember, people have a really hard time sharing it. So if you
yeah.
suspect something, say something and be there. Yeah, be
I
there.
think what you just said is really important about sharing. I didn't have any language to use or stamina or energy to say it. I was able to convey risk with minimal language to my priest. He had to do a lot of the operational type steps for me and his wife. And And it was, I was in the process of going through traumatic shock. And when you're in traumatic shock, you lose your ability to speak. So, um, if you're able to say to someone, if you ever need it, I have a bag here of supplies and you don't have to say a word, you can just grab it.
Mm-hmm.
That might be way more important than you realize, because there may not be a big conversation or a phone call for help, but if they are able
Mm-hmm.
to retrieve it, that might just, be the difference maker.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the big things that you're trying to get people to see in your book, and you do escape, you do get out with your kids. Your kids
Sure. I
do
write a book.
well. Yeah, your kids do well. Things end up good. There's some twists and turns in your healing and ups and
Mhm.
downs, but that's good. But what you're trying to
Yeah.
say in this book is not just a story of abuse,
Mhm.
but that abuse was the natural outpouring of all of this theology that you had
Mhm.
been taught.
Right. I really, really beg people to look at the larger system, which seems to do a very poor job of policing itself and holding itself accountable, and understand and please examine the fruit of these systems. See what is happening. That this is not progress. This is not psychological health. There are people in danger. There are women's children suffering. Look at it, and then don't push it off and say that's just an extreme, or not all Christians are like that. We know not all Christians are like that. We're talking about the ones where it is this way. And that's what we're focused on, because that is what we're here for, is to relieve suffering and improve society. The ones doing it right don't need our cheerleading. It's great for
Yeah.
them. They're doing it right.
And Jesus, yeah, and Jesus leaves the 99 to go after the one. And you know what? It is a whole lot more than one. It is a
It really is.
whole
This
lot
is a
more than
pattern,
one.
and that is
Yeah.
that is important to realize.
Hmm.
This is not isolated.
No. And you paint the picture. There's that through line throughout your book.
Mm,
You start reading John Piper, John MacArthur, you end up, then Doug Wilson, Michael and Debbie Pearl, like all of these, it's a line.
it is.
And it starts with these best-selling people that we keep promoting, not me. I've been talking about
Right.
them
No. We
ad
keep giving
nauseum,
them microphones.
but but it all comes from the same poisoned well. And
Mhm.
I want to read a paragraph where you're trying to explain this. And you said this: the fundamentals and evangelicals wanted to cast the fallen son of TLC's 19 kids and counting as a single bad apple, but he wasn't a single bad apple. He was a product of his making. Duggar was the fruit of a high control system that taught children from infancy to suppress their needs and conform or be beaten. It taught firstborn sons would become eventual patriarchs. It gave young children a premature and inappropriate amount of authority over their younger siblings. It taught males are entitled to gratification and servitude from females who can't say no either to men or to God. Josh Duggar registered no guilt for his crimes because since childhood, he'd grown up with an external moral compass and a feeling of entitlement to women's bodies. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what we did.
that's the thing.
Yeah. And we need to stop saying, oh, look, Josh Duggar is a terrible person. And we need to start saying, evangelicalism created, fundamentalism created Josh Duggar. And he's not the only one.
So just this week, when we are recording this, three Texas pastors have fallen, and
Hmm.
Rick Pidcock, I know we just talked on Threads about this a little bit,
Yeah.
um, just pointed out like, hey, what's happening in Dallas? What's going
Yeah.
on here? There seems to be a problem. And on Instagram, I replied to him and said, I wonder how many apples it takes for people to realize this is an apple tree. And
Yeah.
we need to look at the bigger picture. We tend to individualize these pastors and think that Robert Morris is an anomaly. He is not. He's an example of a wider system. Paul Pressler just died. Paul Pressler was accused of abusing 7 boys. He is the
Hmm.
reason why the Southern Baptist Convention became so conservative. These are through lines and patterns that we need to pull back the lens and understand. This didn't just happen in a bubble. It's not just one apple. It's not one guy.
Hmm.
Duggar is actually a product of an entire environment. Also, incidentally, his appeal was denied last week.
Yes, same time. Yeah, I don't know what's going on in Texas because yeah,
Yeah,
it was like Robert Morris, Tony Evans, Mike something or other. They all got found out in the same week and had to step down, or were forced down or resigned. They should have fired him, but
that's
whatever.
survivor pressure because that's the only
Yeah,
place where accountability is coming is
yeah,
from,
exactly. But you know
yeah,
who else is
whistleblowers.
In Dallas? You got Josh Howerton. You
Yes,
got
you
Matt
do.
Chandler. Like
Yeah, Webben, Joel Webben.
Joel Webben, like there's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff going on, and
Yeah,
I don't think we've ever really heard what happened with Matt Chandler properly. That
right.
does bother me because we've never heard from the woman that he was texting with, or from we've only
Right.
ever heard his story of it,
Hmm.
um, his side of it. So yeah, I
With the seminaries that have a hub there, and the again, like if I can call back to Gothard's evangelistic model was to have people at a conference and then send them out to their
mhm,
churches, and that's how he spread his ideas. The same thing happens in Dallas with those seminaries, and those pastors are being trained in that mindset and that mentality. They're being rewarded for bad behavior and misogyny, and then they go out into their churches and they spread. That's how movements are born, and we've definitely seen that. If we look back over the past 35 years, we've seen that pattern spread across the South and into really the whole nation, which really I think gets us here, um, where the flavors are finding a common thread. Like there's
yeah,
not that much distinction between groups like there used to be.
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, there's people would have used to think there was night and day between someone like Robert Morris and
Mhm.
someone like John Piper because their theologies are so different, and yet
Not
the
really
abuse
anymore.
and the power and control is the same, right?
It's
It's the
yep.
same. And so we have to get back to my prayer, that's what we're here for, is if we're going to have a church, it needs to be something that doesn't look like power and control and authority, but that actually honors women
Mhm.
and teaches that everybody matters. Everybody
That's
gets a
what
voice.
that was Jesus's message. I mean, that
Yeah.
it's the only one that I really care for from that volume is what did Jesus have to say about it? And there it is.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I can see too in your memoir, even though you're talking a lot about how abusive your marriage is, you have a lot of sympathy for your husband, for your ex-husband, it
Mhm.
seems. And I want to read this. I could see now how the majority of Alan's behaviors were trauma responses and fear, mental health issues, and addictive attempts to cope. He faced every day and relationship as a fight, and our religious practices nurtured that paranoia instead of helping him reckon with reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to see his humanity.
Hmm.
That's the better course for myself. That is honoring the fact that he is my children's father, but also
Hmm.
he's not one dimension. He's a fully faceted adult human being. And in the Christian tradition, I believe that if Jesus came for one, came for all.
Hmm.
So he deserves that dignity. He should have had care and concern from his pastors.
Hmm.
He should have had support. He should have been when he went for help, when he was looking for books and answers, he should have found resources that encouraged him to be a healthier human. It would have
Hmm.
made all the difference in the world,
Yeah. Rather than just told him he was entitled to be in control. Yeah.
right?
And this is important too, is that we realize that when Christianity sets itself up as an authority system with people at the top, then people who are profoundly insecure, men who will gravitate to that because it gives them some power
Right.
without them having to earn it. So they
Hmm.
get unearned power, which makes them feel better about themselves,
Right.
but it leads to very unhealthy dynamics. People with
Mhm.
mental illnesses will gravitate to that for very similar reasons. Narcissists will definitely gravitate to that because, yeah, it gives them control over people. And so when we set up religion as being about authority and power and control, we are going to attract people who want an excuse to have power over others.
Right.
And
And
it's
who
going to
needs it?
be,
When
and
you're
it's
dealing
going to
with ill
corrupt
people,
others
they need it.
too.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. It continues the generational line that it actually
Mhm.
brings us down. It doesn't bring us towards light and
No.
progress and greater awareness of our humanity and understanding and compassion. And I want an expansive spirituality. I want health and vitality and love. I
Hmm.
don't want to keep going back into these mean little models where people suffer by
Yeah.
design.
Yeah, it's so wrong. Well, I love, okay, everyone, you got to follow Tia on Instagram. She has awesome reels. She has a great Substack. I will put links to all of those things in the notes. But of course, please read A Well-Trained Wife. It's a really well-written story. It's really touching. And I think there's a lot for us to learn in it. And we need to listen. We need to listen. Even if you are not being abused, you need to listen so that you understand the mindset both of abusers and of those who are victims. Um,
Mm.
but if you're wondering if your marriage is like this or if it's going in this direction, this book has so many really good red flags for you to notice. So please pick it up. Again, all those links will be in the podcast notes. Anything that you want to say to our audience?
Keep your courage. I think these are trying times, and I really lean towards making eye contact and being human with one another and being curious every single day. Ask
Eh,
questions and be curious
with your regular voice.
with your regular voice, with everything that you were created to use. Stand in your power.
Amen. Thank you, Tia.
Thank you.
It was so fun for me to talk to her in person, and such a great interview. I can't tell you how much it impacted me reading the book and realizing how similar our stories are in so many ways, with both of us having children who died of the same thing in almost the same year at roughly the same age. And yet my story and her story are very different because I didn't embrace the toxic stuff. I didn't grow up with this toxic stuff. And please, we don't want people to grow up like Tia did. We don't want people stuck and sucked into things like Tia was. And so pick up The Well-Trained Wife. The link is in the podcast notes. Spread it around so that other people can spot the issues. Again, thank you to our sponsor, the Kingdom Girls Bible. And Tia is going to be with us again next week on the Bare Marriage Podcast. Marissa Burt is joining us as well as we take a look at the book, The Excellent Wife. And that's a really good podcast. I am so looking forward to that one. It's horrid, but it's important. So join us again next week, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.